Hello. So, straight to the point, just for a little change. I want to talk about burnout. So, if you want to learn a little bit more about what my thoughts are on burnout and sort of simple way to think about it, and then with that simple way to think about it, you might be able to figure out strategies to put in place to try and make you feel less burned out, then stick around for the next 8 or 9 minutes. So, why am I even talking about this in the first place? So, I would say last week, and it goes through cycles sometimes. Doesn't seem to matter what I'm doing. Even when I was working full shift patterns in the A&E department, um, I would go through spells where things would just catch up with me. So, I did the full range of 24/7 shifts for many years, including bouncing out of nights and into days and late and all that kind of stuff. You don't need me to explain what shift work is like. Most of you, it can be quite tough. So I don't work shifts anymore, um, but in a lot of ways, I essentially work Monday to Friday now, 9 till 5. But that's got its challenges as well. I've always said that any experience of 9 to 5 jobs I've done in the past was almost more tiring. So it's just a different set of challenges. It's not easier. It's just different. I think also having kids as well. So I'm not finishing work at 5 and having dinner and having my evenings to myself, to do whatever I want to. I'm doing what I want to. My choice to have children at the end of the day, and it is great, but again, it is different, and it does introduce different stresses and strains in your life as well. Where you can't just sit around watching TV for the entire night and then go to bed. Like, you've got other responsibilities. You've got kids that you need to make sure are fed and ready for the next day ahead of them. And pause and have a little drink from the tiniest cup of coffee. So yeah, so I like to try and scientifically approach these things. I've not burned out to the point where I've needed to take extended periods of time off work, or look to be signed off work or anything like that. Whether that should have happened is another discussion, but I've never had to do that, fortunately. But there are definitely periods that I can identify, times where I took a year out of training to take some pressure, or the pressure of training, off. I would say I probably felt a bit burned out then. Certainly, the most burned out I've felt in recent years was probably when I finished my postgraduate training and just before I got my first consultant job in emergency medicine. I could kind of look back and go, that's a decade of my life that I've just devoted to getting to this point, and I was both pleased and absolutely shattered at the same time. Um, and then that partly motivated my decision making for that year, which was to again take a year where I could control what I was doing. And I locumed that year. I sacrificed a bit of job security. I had to travel a bit, but actually that worked out pretty well, because I then had the flexibility over when I could work, when I could take time off. It allowed me to do other career things that interested me. It allowed me to spend more time with my family, and that was a great year, and it allowed me just to figure out what I wanted to do next. So yeah, so if you've been following what's been going on, I haven't revealed massive amounts of detail about what's been going on career-wise for me, but you'll know I left the NHS, I left my job in A&E. Very difficult decision, but ultimately I had to balance my equation, burnout-wise, and try and think ahead of, yes, I could physically continue to do this job for quite a long time, but I know that something is going to give. Um, and when I feel like something is not right, I will tend to try and take a bit of a step back. It's quite hard, when you're in the middle of it and you're knackered and you just feel like you've got no time. But it is really important to just find some time, go for a walk, sit in a dark room, do whatever within reason you need to do to kind of take some of that pressure off yourself, to be able to just analyze what's going on for you. And I approach this very much, like a science experiment to some degree. So, there was I forget the name of there's a psychologist who had a book out fairly recently that I had started reading, which I haven't finished reading yet, and she does some really, really good stuff on Instagram. And so this model is very, very similar to what she was describing about burnout. And I like to think of it as just thinking back to medical stuff. So when the amount of something that you have, say in your bloodstream, for example, will depend on three things, broadly speaking. So it's inputs, processing, and outputs. Okay, so that will determine the balance essentially. So it's a very simple kind of simple equation. So how much of that thing is being produced? Is it less than normal? Is it around the right amount? Is it more than normal? The processing, is less of it being processed than normal? Is it about the right amount, or is it too much being processed? And then the outputs, is there less getting out? Is there about the right amount getting out? Is there more getting out than normal? The balance of those three things in that equation will ultimately determine how much of that thing is present, in your bloodstream or in your life. In this example, so that's kind of how I think about burnout. Now, does it stop me feeling burned out? Absolutely not, but it does help me to think about the different factors in each column that might be contributing to it. Okay, so that kind of middle part of it is essentially your burnout tolerance. So it's like the stress bucket theory. So you can imagine whatever receptacle you like as the vessel. You are essentially that vessel, or that vessel is kind of part of you. So the inputs are things that potentially put stress on you, whatever it may be. So divide that into work life, home life. Break it down even further. If you're someone who's in business and you've got lots of different business interests, other what things are causing you more stress than others. So what are all those inputs into that vessel? Okay, that's all the things that are applying stress on you. Then think about the capacity of that vessel. So in the stress bucket theory, I like to think that actually there's no fixed capacity of that vessel. Some days it will be better than others depending on how you're feeling on that day. If you're more tired that day, actually your capacity to deal with stress might be less. Other days it might be more. So there's a lot of variables to think about here. So you've got the holding capacity of that vessel and the size of it, and then you've got the output. Okay, so the outputs are how you're dealing with that stress. Okay, so it might even be things like how you're eating, how you're sleeping, your ability to decompress in whatever way that may be. And I'm talking about healthy things. So if you're doing things like drinking to cope with it, then that's not a healthy way to be dealing with that, and that needs to be addressed. Same with drugs and behavior, extreme behavioral type things. Those things need to be addressed. But what do you do to address that? Do you spend time with people? Do you spend time on your own? Do you go on spa days? Do you go for a run? Do you go to the gym? So all those outputs are the things that allow you to manage that stress. So those things need to be balanced. Okay, so when at times where you're having to take that step back and have a look at things as a whole, that's how you can approach it. And it's really, really hard when you're in the thick of it. So you might need to enlist the help of someone to kind of talk it through with, or even write it down if that kind of thing makes sense to you. So start to map out those three columns: inputs, the vessel, the processing, and the output. So where are the stresses coming from? Can you reduce or divert or manage those in some way? The processing, is there anything you can do to increase the size of your stress receptacle, your stress bucket? You know, improve your sleep, improve your eating, that kind of thing, to improve your capacity to deal with the stress. Looking at things like mindfulness meditation, journaling, anything along those lines that works for you. And then outputs. How do you currently deal with stress? How could you deal with stress better? Okay, so that's a simple way to think about stress and burnout. A very simple burnout equation, a very simple way that you can step back and analyze what's going on if you feel stressed and burned out. Let me know what you think about that. Let me know if you've been feeling stressed or burned out and what you've been doing about it. And I will catch up with you in the next one.